Hey, just wanted to throw a spoiler alert at the beginning of this so nobody gets spoiled. If you haven't seen the movie, I highly suggest it. Go watch it before you watch this. So before we get started, I do want to say that this will be in the format that my Minions review was in. I'll just be using clips from the trailers as I did last time. That way I don't get copyright claimed, because even though I don't make any type of money from this at all, it's still a little demoralizing, and sometimes I can't even post the video. So without further ado, let's get into the actual movie. So we start off the movie with Gorr, who's with his daughter, who eventually ends up dying from thirst and starvation. And then when Gorr goes to his god, who's named Rapu, which you don't know from the movie, I'm actually telling you from the wiki page. I did not know half the names of all these other people. Rapu basically just makes fun of him and is like, all your purposes is to suffer in my name and pray to me. I don't care about you. And so Gorr decides, hey, I renounce you. If you're gonna be like this, I'm not gonna worship you. And Rapu decides to kill him. So the Necrosword calls to Gorr, and as soon as Gorr touches it, he gets this vision of the future, and what we later find out is eternity. And then he uses the sword to kill Rapu. I thought this was a really interesting moment, because obviously you've got to set up like, oh, this is why the character doesn't like the gods. This is why he's so adamantly against them. And so to have this random god from some random mythology that's not super mainstream is interesting. It would have been nice maybe to have like a Norse god, because that makes a bit more of a correlation back to Thor and Valkyrie, and later on the Mighty Thor, right? If you like Frey somehow screw over this guy, even though Frey is considered a good guy, or maybe in the past Odin did something to him. I think that would have been an interesting change, but other than that, it's pretty cool. I like how the Necrosword is somewhat like a sentient being, and it feels like later on in the movie that he's pretty much controlling Gorr completely. Then we see Thor, who's, as far as I can tell, still pretty depressed from everything that went on with Endgame and Infinity War, and he just chills out and waits for someone to call on him, and then he goes into battle, destroys this temple. But right before he goes into battle, we have a really interesting moment where he puts on this like 80s like rocker vest, and for some reason a lot of the media that's been coming out recently has been really like 80s focused. Like for Stranger Things, it makes sense, you know, running up that hill, that was music that was popular back in the 80s. The show is in the 80s, but this movie had nothing to do with like that time period at all. I mean, even when you see the logo, there's this guitar riff, and it sounds pretty good. I'm not complaining about how it sounds. I just feel it's a little misplaced. And honestly, as soon as Thor put on that vest, I was like, they're gonna play Sweet Child of Mine at some point in this movie. There's no way they don't. And they did, like 40 minutes later, so I was clearly right about that. So after the battle, they all head to the ship, and when they get in the ship, they realize that they're getting all these distress calls from people around the galaxy, mainly gods, that are calling out and being like, Gorr's coming, Gorr's this, Gorr's that. And Thor takes particular interest in one from Lady Sif. And we have a really interesting character moment with Thor and Peter Quill, because Thor is deciding to leave them because he wants to go save Lady Sif, and they're gonna go try to save all the other people throughout the galaxy. And Thor's talking about how he's always been looking, trying to find himself and try to realize who he was. That made me really think. In Thor 1, he's just trying to become worthy, trying to become a good person. In Thor 2, he's more so trying to interact with his brother. Really don't remember that movie. It's the worst one. Thor 3, he's trying to cope with the death of his father and free Asgard from Hela. Like, that's his main objective. And so he really didn't have a lot of time for introspection. And when he did, felt almost like his worldview would get shattered. Like when he showed up to fight Thanos, and there's this big bad entrance, and he goes in, and the famous "you should have went for the head" scene happens, and he realizes that he fell. No matter what he did, he failed. And quite honestly, even if he had gone for the head, he might have missed. But it's really interesting to see a person who's been around for thousands of years try to struggle with like their sense of self. And this would not work at all if Thor 1 was not a thing. If there was just no Thor 1 and he had never had to struggle with becoming worthy of the hammer, then this would be completely stupid. But the way it all comes together is very good. So Thor goes to Sif, and Sif tells Thor that Gorr took her out and took her arm, and her next target is New Asgard. So he immediately heads there. And while this is going on, Jane Foster, it turns out she has terminal cancer. Most out of nowhere thing ever. Maybe it was in like one of the Disney Plus shows or something, but it's pretty abrupt the way I see it. So she goes to her lab, and one of the books starts glowing, so she starts flipping through the pages. Then she heads to New Asgard, where the pieces of Mjolnir are, and thunder's flashing all around her. And it's weird because there's a bunch of guards there, and she's like right up on the exhibit, putting her hands like near it and stuff. I doubt they would let her do that, but it is what it is. It's not a huge problem, it's just a weird thing. So then Mjolnir comes back together, and because of the fact that Thor made Mjolnir to promise to always protect her, that's what Mjolnir did by staying with her and giving her the power to wield her, or him. We don't know. I'm guessing Mjolnir is a him. Thor shows up in time to fight all the beasts that Gorr has sent out. We have a really awesome moment where Thor sees Gorr and immediately goes after him, and he can instantly identify the threat, and he's like, okay, you're the main problem here, I gotta take you down. I think that was really good because, like, despite all these problems that he's facing, he's still Thor. He's still been fighting for thousands of years. He's not gonna be scared of some run-of-the-mill guy. He meets Jane again, and it's a really interesting scene because they're both surprised, and it's been 8 years since they've seen each other. Thor knows it like down to the day, but Gorr decides that he's not going to be able to win the fight once both Thors, because Jane Foster is a Thor now. That's a problem that we'll talk about later, but they're going after him, and so is Valkyrie. So he's like, oh, I can't win, I'm just gonna take all the children, and he does that and he disappears. So then the next day, everyone's in town hall asking, hey, where are my children? What are we going to do? And it's all a mess. People start fighting. And so Thor speaks up and he says, Asgard. And he has a speech for a little bit. And I thought it was a really awesome moment. I was like, oh, this is great. Like, the rightful ruler of Asgard is stepping up again because he sees a need, right? And then he decides, oh, I'm going to save your children. And he flies off. I don't know where he was aiming, but he blows a hole in the roof and bounces off something and hits a monument. Now, in and of itself, the moment was kind of funny, but it's a weird tone shift to show like, oh, Thor's coming back. Thor is going to show his leadership skills, why he was the rightful king of Asgard, what made him such a good leader, whether it be, on Earth with the Avengers, or even though he really was not the leader of that team, just being a leader in general would have been something interesting for him to do at this point. And it was a weird fake out, but it's not like he's rendered like super weak. It's not like a Luke Skywalker type of thing where he's just not able to fend for himself at all. He still has agency. He's still a person who's very much in the fight, very much contributing. In fact, he's the reason at the end of the movie happens. So I'm not going to spoil that, even though I already put a spoiler warning at the beginning of the video. So after that point, Alex, or Astrid, pretty sure his name is Axel. I don't know why I said Alex. Obviously they're playing Axel, Guns N' Roses, Axl Rose, whatever. It's weird. But anyway, they have this like thing where Thor can shadow walk when he's connected to Axl. And what he does is, once he connects and he finds out where they are, he starts talking to them. Starts trying to figure out where they are. And after that, he leaves. And he's like, okay, they're in the Shadow Realm. And they all gear up to go to the Shadow Realm to go get the kids back. And Valkyrie's like, wouldn't he be the most powerful in the Shadow Realm because he's got shadows and uses them to travel? Which is a good point. Thor's like, okay, so let's go to omnipotency is what he says. But looking at the wiki page, it says omnipotent city. It's weird that they say it like omnipotency. But they walk in wearing disguises, which I kind of didn't get because they're gods. They could just go in and talk about what they needed to talk about. Also, Jane was like really confused as to why a god of Greek mythology and a god of Norse mythology can also exist in the same way, which is weird because it's like, is there no Percy Jackson in this universe? Obviously not a real walking around Percy Jackson, but one in like books. Or is there like no analog? And also, she knows that aliens and dark elves exist. But other mythologies is where she draws the line. I guess it is a lot for someone to take in at once. But so Zeus and all the rest of the gods are having a little party with Zeus commentating. And Thor tries to talk to Zeus, but he's not getting anywhere. Zeus is like, oh, Gorr doesn't know about this place, and this place is secret. But if he gets you, then he'll know about this place. So you all can't leave, which is weird because he even says himself that if Gorr reaches eternity, which Zeus thinks he can't, but if he does reach eternity, he can have any wish. Now we later find out that the key was actually the Stormbreaker axe, which is an interesting thing because it's like, oh, the key that was made 5 years ago for this thing that's literally called eternity. And we come across this thing later on where Jane is able to get to where Thor is insanely fast. Can she access the Bifrost with Mjolnir? Why not just take Mjolnir? While we're on the subject of Mjolnir, I said millionaire, but there's this weird thing where because all the pieces were broken apart, she can shoot them like a meteor shower. That is the first time ever in one of these movies, like a superhero movie or just any type of supernatural movie, where I sat there and gone, what? Because that is the most ridiculous looking thing I've ever seen. I don't know why they chose to do that. I don't know what made them think that it looked cool. Maybe to some people it did, but to me, I was like, what is this? What is this? I don't understand it. I don't get it at all, but it is what it is. But back to Zeus. After all this happens, Thor was chained up with lightning. He breaks the lightning chains and is fighting. Zeus decides to kill Korg. And it's a good thing he went after him and not Valkyrie, because if he did, this would be a very different movie. I thought Korg was actually about to die. Genuine. Like, when Korg fell over and all his rocks were falling out and away from him, I was like, whoa. Like, that, talk about a tone shift. This movie has had its serious moments, but it's sort of flittered back and forth between serious and unserious, and just continually done that sort of thing. Kill off a comedic main character that's pretty much done nothing wrong. In fact, I can't even think of a thing that he has done wrong. It was such an insane thing. So then Zeus throws the thunderbolt, or the lightning bolt, and Thor catches it, sort of imbues it with his own energy, I guess you could say, and then throws it right back at him and seemingly kills, which is insane because, I mean, at that point, you're basically king of the gods. You just killed the most powerful god, as far as you know. Why not just take his place and then be like, hey, join our army, I'm your king now? But whatever. So then Korg lying on the ground, sort of just chilling out there. Thor tries to shift through all the rubble because Korg starts calling out to him, and so he's just a face now. He gets tied to the back of Tessa Thompson's head, Valkyrie, with her braids. Probably the weirdest moment in the movie. She could have stuck him in his, and they're like, actually that's probably the best place to put him. now I'm thinking about it from this perspective. It's probably the best place for him to go. The Valkyrie goes up onto the podium that Zeus was on for literally no reason other than to flirt with one of the girls, and then they start playing Sweet Child of Mine. I was like, oh, I called it. Since at this point we're starting to reach the end of the movie, it starts to ramp up a little bit more. Thor, the Mighty Thor, Jane Foster is the Mighty Thor at this point, and Valkyrie are all gearing up for the fight. Obviously Korg can't fight anymore. Probably a good choice from a writing perspective, given how serious of a villain Gorr is and how unserious of a person Korg is. It really would not have matched thematically, so it's probably a good idea. Jane and Thor finally make up after all this time. Pretty good scene. And Jane tells Thor she has cancer. Thor's like, let's live in the moment. Pretty run-of-the-mill stuff, but I think it was handled pretty well. So once they arrive in the Shadow Realm where they thought the kids were, kids aren't in the cage. They go in Gorr's tent, and Jane splits off from the group, which originally I thought, well, that's a horrible idea. Not gonna go good at all. She sees a tablet, and she realizes that the Bifrost is the key. She runs back to Thor, and at first I had a brain loss moment where I was like, the key to what? Just not thinking. But then I was like, oh, the key to get to eternity. I'm guessing that pretty much anything that was able to access the Bifrost would have been able to do that, but they make it seem like Stormbreaker's the only key. In fact, she runs back, takes the Stormbreaker, and flings it out the window. And then Gorr comes in. If Gorr was 10 seconds faster, he would have just taken it then and there. Ties them all up, and this is probably Christian Bale's second best scene in the movie because he's just acting so well. In fact, Gorr was done so good. Jeez, I can't say enough about how well Gorr was acted. Obviously, Christian Bale, we've seen him in The Dark Knight, so we know what he can do, but seeing him take this character and just put him onto the screen so well, because I've seen some Gorr The God Butcher comics, and I think he did him so well. From the beginning, playing this emaciated fanatic worshiper of this god, to now becoming this hateful person whose only purpose in life is to eradicate all of the gods. I thought it was such a good portrayal of this character, so he knocked it out of the park. So Gorr keeps telling Thor, call the axe, obviously talking about Stormbreaker. And Thor gets to the point where he's like, alright, I'll call it. And he causes this big explosion, and they all fight. And Jane and Valkyrie go after all of the shadow monsters while Thor stays to fight Gorr. They did a really good job in this movie of balancing how capable Thor was with how much of a threat Gorr was, because even though Thor's strong, he can't beat Gorr simply because of the Necrosword and all the advantages that the Necrosword affords him. It's really interesting how they gave the lightning bolt to Valkyrie. I mean, I guess it makes sense because Stormbreaker originally wasn't too happy when Thor picked it up. It is what it is. I guess you can kind of tell Stormbreaker, hey, you aren't the lightning bolt. If you want to be more involved and get more powerful, I guess. Also, this movie came out of nowhere with the sentience of the weapons, and apparently the lightning bolt isn't sentient, but Mjolnir, which I can accept that being sentient, but Stormbreaker seems a little weird. Just my personal opinion. It ends up switching with Thor fighting the monsters and Valkyrie fighting with Gorr, and you can tell by the framing of the scene that every swing Gorr took, he was getting closer and closer to getting her, and he ended up impaling her. And so she's badly injured. Jane rushes over, gets her. Thor comes and calls the Bifrost to get them all up out of there. Korg, the screaming goats that were driving the boat, all of them. And then they go to leave, but at the very last second, Gorr comes up and grabs Stormbreaker, and Thor's trying to pull him away, but he can't. And so Thor gets sucked up into the Bifrost, and Gorr has the Necro Sword and Stormbreaker. They all slam it at Earth because Thor can't aim his Bifrost very well, and he decides to take Jane to the hospital because she looks horrible whenever she's not holding her hammer, and she's like crawling trying to get to the hammer, and right before she grabs it, she falls over. I kind of thought she was dead. I was like, there's no way they'll kill her in that kind of way. I was right. They go to a hospital. Thor finds out that the hammer is like adding to her cancer, which is weird because they imply when she's flipping through the pages of the book that was above the one that was glowing, one of the things they say is great health, and they highlight that. So you'd think like she'd be like, if anything, bolstered because of the fact that she's using the hammer. But they have this interesting scene where Thor's like, I love you, Jane, and I don't want you to die. And Jane's like, you better come back to me. And so Thor leaves after a brief conversation with Valkyrie. He uses the Thunderbolt to teleport. Don't know how he knows how to do that, but I guess he picked it up somewhere because he's a god. You know, he's probably heard stories of how Zeus would teleport. So Thor shows up, and Gorr's like, okay, summon all my shadow monsters once again. And as they're approaching the children, Thor's like, okay, I'm going to imbue you all with the power of Thor. And he does that for a temporary amount of time using the lightning bolt. The only way that works in my mind is that he sort of concentrated his power, sort of how like Mjolnir and Stormbreaker work. Like, he still has the power with or without them. It's just that sort of a conduit for that same power. So they all run in, and funnily enough, Thor's interest to the scene was one of the heads of the statues near Eternity fell down, and I thought for a second that it had crushed the children. In the back of my head, I'm like, this is a PG-13 movie. They're not gonna kill a bunch of children, especially in a comedy movie that's now trying to get serious. It just can't happen. And Thor saves them like Mr. Incredible style. So Thor and Gorr fight for a little bit, and Gorr actually sort of gains the upper hand, and he's about to stab Thor with the Necro Sword. Jane realizes this and somehow gets to her hammer because it's floating next to her bedside. I don't know why I said somehow. I instantly realized that. But I guess Mjolnir has Bifrost too, but you can't use that because that's not Thor's weapon. It's weird, but it is what it is. It's a little bit of a problem, but not lore breaking for me. It's just odd. Thor then leaves Jane to fight Gorr, which was silly. He should have just had Jane go after Stormbreaker and try to pull Stormbreaker up out of the ground while he fights Gorr because he's the more competent warrior. It just makes the most sense. She's a person who's very analytical, very intellectual. It would make a lot more sense for her to try to fix this problem of the door opening with Stormbreaker. So eventually Thor is able to knock Stormbreaker up out of the ground and hits the ground. Then the door is open completely, and Thor begins to fight Gorr. Gets in sort of a blade lock by separating the lightning bolt into two and crossing his lightning bolt with Gorr's sword. And then he locks eyes with Jane. They both nod, and Thor turns and lets Jane hit the sword with Mjolnir, which explodes it. And then Gorr calls the handle of the sword to him and is calling the rest of the pieces together. And Jane pulled them all together using the pieces of Mjolnir, and then she destroys the sword falls out, and Gorr, seeing this, gets up. Gorr walks through the door, and then Gorr, Thor, and Jane are all sitting in this pool of water. Got this eternity figure sitting there, sort of like the god in Full Metal Alchemist. And Gorr tries to reach out to him, and then Thor sort of talk no jutsus him out of it and makes him realize, you want love. And I was like, oh, he wants love. Like, he just wants to love somebody. No, he wants his daughter love. And I was like, that's an interesting moment. And Gorr's like, I'm dying, she'll be all alone. And Jane goes, oh, she won't be alone. In that moment, Gorr reaches out to eternity. Jane dies, which I was kind of, not too happy about, because I felt like they were building her up to sort of be around. They would find some sort of cure. Also, Thor's, like, he has to know, like, gods of healing and stuff. Like, if he's in the Norse mythology, Frey is the god of healing. Reach out to Frey. Be like, hey, my girlfriend has stage 4 cancer. Can you heal her? And him being Frey, he's gonna be like, yeah, I'll heal her. Bing bang boom, movie over. So Love, the daughter of Gorr, shows up, and Thor decides to take care of her. So everything ends up alright. We get a little narration to end it off. All the kids are training, and Thor and Love hang out for a little bit. Thor is dealing with the loss of Jane and raising Love. They have an interesting moment where they talk about the fact that Love doesn't want to wear her boots and she wants to wear slippers, and Thor's like, alright, fine, do what you want, don't complain to me when your feet hurt. And she's like, okay, fine, I'll wear my boots. And so they talk for a little bit. Thor picks up Mjolnir, which he's drawn over. They walk out. Thor hands Stormbreaker to Love, and the movie ends. I don't have any problem with Thor switching back to Mjolnir. It makes a little sense. He wanted to be with Mjolnir since Ragnarok, and then my thought moved to Stormbreaker, because isn't that like him leaving Stormbreaker, like Jane left him with a handwritten note? I don't even think he gave Stormbreaker a note. I don't know, if you're gonna establish these people as semi-characters, you sort of gotta involve them, If you make a weapon that's going to want to stick with a host, and it gets stuck with another host, and it's given reaction to things around it before, I want to see its reaction to that thing. It feels like a big thing, but hey, that's probably the biggest problem with the movie right there. When it comes to tone, I'm happy with all the comedy. I think they could have told a few less jokes, but that's just how you turn it down. Marvel is. We have a mid-credit scene of Zeus actually being alive and sending Hercules to kill Thor, which will end in Hercules' death, because they're not gonna send some rando in and expect him to actually take out Thor. But of course, that's gonna be in like 2032. It's not gonna be that long. It's gonna be like in 2026 when we get Thor 5. Because I feel like this movie is gonna do really good. Jane Foster actually also goes to Valhalla, which is weird. She didn't die in battle, even though Thor told Sif you had to die in battle. She died lying there, so she didn't go to Valhalla according to Thor, but she did, I guess, because she was a valiant warrior, which I guess you could sort of play off as Thor being just wrong. Like, he was just completely wrong about it. All in all, I thought this movie was pretty good. Some people were complaining about how the movie was going to be the gayest movie in the MCU, which is the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. In fact, the only gay thing I can even remember from the movie, having watched it, like maybe the fact that like Korg species reproduces because the males sit there and hold hands over lava, which who cares, really? Who cares? I'm genuinely wondering, who cares? I don't know. I just have bigger things to care about than, oh my god, they hold hands. It's not even, unless you want to say that holding hands is, I'm not even going to get into that. It doesn't matter. It does not matter at all. I'm saying that more to me than anyone else. Anyway, thank you all for watching, especially if you watched this long, because this is going to be like 45 minutes, because we're at 50 minutes right now, but I take pauses every now and then, so I'm going to have to edit this down a little bit. Thank you all for watching. Goodbye.